All right, welcome to today's cooking demo. Today we are going to be doing some baking. We've done some of the techniques for cooking of meats and proteins. Today we're going to get into some baking. Now, I will go ahead and say up front that I am not a baker by trade. Baking is a whole nother area of culinary. I did take a baking class when I was in culinary school, and I've done some baking. And you can do baking at home, obviously, but there's a lot more to baking than meets the eye. There's a lot of math involved in professional baking. There's some chemistry involved in professional baking. So the one thing I do want to say is that when you're trying to follow a recipe for baking, make sure you follow that recipe exactly. These recipes have been tested and tried. The developers know exactly what needs to go in. And in baking, every ingredient serves a purpose. And so it's very important that you don't try to substitute ingredients or increase or decrease because it can really mess up whatever it is that you're trying to bake. So what we're going to be doing today is just a simple recipe for what are known as soft rolls, a type of bread that you could serve with a meal. You could use it as a slider bun, something like that. So we're going to get started. So I've got my mise en place here, everything set up. I just want to go over a couple things that we're going to be using today. We've got our bread flour here. Now, bread flour is different than all-purpose flour. It's different even than whole wheat flour. Bread flour uses different kinds of wheat and also uses what's known as different streams when they're milling it to produce a higher gluten content or higher protein content. Actually, when you add the water or the moisture to the flour, then that gluten starts to form. And that's one of the characteristics of breads, is that you want that gluten in there. Other types of flour, again, there's all-purpose flour, which is what you might use at home for making cookies or just general baking biscuits, shortbreads, things like that can use all-purpose flour. If you're making cakes or things that you want to have a lighter, airier texture, you would use cake flour, which has less protein than all-purpose flour and a lot less than bread flour. That's what gives cakes their lightness and fluffiness. But since we're making bread, we're making rolls, we're going to be using bread flour. We're also going to be using some active dry yeast. I've already opened up the packages of my yeast, and I've got them right here in my mise en place, but you'll need some yeast. These are sold usually in quarter-ounce packages like this. A lot of times they'll come three kind of fastened together there, or you can buy it in a jar, either way. But you're going to need 3/4 of an ounce of yeast, and I'll have the recipe posted in modules here for you. We're going to be using some non-fat dry milk, which is going to add some milk solids to what we're doing. And I mentioned just a moment ago that the yeast comes in measured in ounces. In professional baking especially, all your measurements are done by weight. And if you're using a professional recipe or you're using a recipe that uses weight, you probably want to invest in a good electronic scale. I've got one here that will weigh your ingredients for you. You can do it either in pounds and ounces, or you can do it in grams and kilograms. This one you can just swap back and forth here. But if you're going to be doing a lot of baking, and again, using recipes that use weight measurements instead of volume measurements, I highly recommend these. They're not expensive. I think I got this one at Bed Bath & Beyond. You can order them online, but get a good electronic scale for weighing your ingredients. Because I don't know what equipment you have, I have converted this recipe to just use standard measurements of volume, cups, teaspoons, tablespoons, things like that. But if you've got an electronic scale, I highly recommend that you use that. So we've got our flour here, we've got our yeast already. We're also going to be using some sugar, some salt, some shortening, and some butter. And I'll go over those as we get into it. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get our yeast activated. This is what's called active dry yeast, and hold it up to the camera here. You can see that it's in tiny little granules right there. So what we have to do is we have to provide some moisture and also a food source. If you remember back to your basic science class, some of your biology classes, yeast is an organism, and it requires food in order to activate it. In this case, it's going to be sugar. So what we're going to do is I've measured out some warm water. Again, we want to use warm water because that's going to activate the yeast quicker. So I've got 1 3/4 cup here. I'm going to use 3/4 of a cup to activate the yeast, and the other cup we'll use when we actually are making the dough. So I'm going to pour 3/4 of a cup measure it out first, just to make sure I don't mess anything up. I'm gonna measure out 3/4 of a cup, and I'm gonna pour that right into the mixing bowl of my stand mixer. Now, obviously, I'm using this stand mixer. I highly recommend, again, if you've got one, use it. It doesn't have to be this brand, but for mixing dough, which takes several minutes, it's a lot easier than using a hand mixer. However, if that's all you've got a hand mixer right here, you obviously can use that with your dough hook attachments on there. You can see these are the dough hooks right here for this one. But you're going to have to stand there and hold this in the bowl for several minutes while your dough mixes. So if you've got a stand mixer, I encourage you to use that. If not, though, this will work just fine. But I'm going to use my stand mixer today. So I've got the water in there. Now the next thing that we need is we need 3 teaspoons of sugar. I've got my sugar right here. And again, this is the food source for the yeast. So I'm just going to add 1, 2, 3. Now this is 2 ounces of sugar. And again, I'll have the other measurements. The rest of this is going to go in with our dough, but I'm using some of this to activate the yeast. I'm going to pull this off, swirl this around just a bit to mix that sugar up. And then I'm going to add the yeast right into there. Now we have to let that sit for a few minutes and activate. And you'll know that it's activating when you start seeing it bubble and start to become kind of frothy a little bit. I'm going to mix this up just a bit. Swirl that around in there. And again, you can see that right there. So we'll let that sit for a minute. And while that is, again, activating, we're going to mix in some other ingredients with our flour. I've already measured out the flour. This is 4 cups of bread flour. And again, we're going to take the rest of our sugar, and we're going to put that in there. Got 2 teaspoons of salt. Add that in there. 1/3 of a cup of our instant non-fat dry milk. That's going right in here. Move this a little closer to this camera. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to take a wire whisk and I'm just going to carefully mix those dry ingredients together. A lot of times in baking or baking recipes, it will tell you to sift these ingredients together. You can certainly do that if you have a fine mesh strainer or even a drum sieve. But doing it like this will be just fine for our purposes today. I can already smell the yeast activating over there, starting to smell bready, which is what we want. Again, I'm just mixing in these dry ingredients, and once this yeast activates, then we will put this right into our mixing bowl. And it may take a few minutes for your yeast to activate. Again, I'm just kind of swirling this around in the bowl here because some of that kind of stuck to the sides. You can see right here it's kind of getting a little milky looking or a little cloudy. That's good. That's what we want. That means that yeast is, again, activating in that warm sugar water, starting to feed on that sugar. And then once we start seeing some little bubbles pop up there, then we will add the rest of our warm water. We'll add the flour and the other ingredients, and then we'll begin to mix it. So I'm going to give that just a minute or two, and then we'll come back to it. All right, so our yeast is starting to get a little foamy, starting to bubble there, so this is ready. See if I can show that to you right there. Not sure if you can see it real good. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the rest, or this flour mixture that we have mixed up. We're going to add it right into this bowl carefully. We're going to add the rest of our water here, which is about a cup. Then we're going to put right in the shortening, 2 ounces of shortening or 2 tablespoons, and 2 tablespoons of butter. Put this back into to our mixer, lock that on. Then I have my dough hook for this stand mixer. Again, if you don't have a stand mixer, you can use a hand mixer like this with your dough hooks attached. Gonna raise my bowl up. And I will go ahead and warn you, this is going to be a little loud, so I'm going to let you see it for just a moment or two, and then I will probably stop the video while this mixes. It's going to take about 8 to 10 minutes for this dough to mix up and get nice and smooth, and that's what we want. We don't want any lumps of butter or shortening or even lumps of flour, obviously. So we'll start this going here on the lowest speed. That way we don't make a big mess. You've probably seen videos, whatnot, of people turning on a mixer on high with flour. The flour just goes everywhere. We don't want that to happen. So we're going to start this on low just until everything starts to get mixed up. Once all the ingredients are incorporated, then what I'll do is increase the speed on the mixer and let that continue to mix, again, for about 8 to 10 minutes until the dough gets nice and smooth. You'll see it start pulling away from the sides of the mixing bowl. All right, so most of the water's been incorporated, so I'm going to increase the speed on this. One thing we want to be careful with is we don't want to overmix the dough. We want it to be nice and smooth. We want everything to be mixed up, but we don't want to overmix it. So we're just going to watch it, pay attention to it. Again, I'll pause the video here. We'll come back to it in a couple of minutes. I'll show you what the finished product looks like. All right, so it's been about 8 minutes. As you can see here, I'm going to drop this bowl down and pop this off. You can see we've got a nice piece of dough. It's kind of come up our dough hook here, but that's okay. It is slightly tacky to the touch, which means it's a little bit sticky, but it's not sticking to my fingers. That's what we're looking for. We want it to be a little tacky, but we don't want it to be so sticky that, it's doing, like I said, sticking to my fingers. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove this dough hook. And I'm gonna push this mixer out of the way so that we can see what's going on here. I'm just gonna kind of clean my dough hook off here. Again, it's a little sticky, but not too bad. Set that dough hook to the side. And as you can see here, most of the dough has pulled away from the sides so that it's all in this one lump or ball of dough. Now, for the fun part, we wait again. As I mentioned last time, a lot of times cooking is a very patient effort. It requires a lot of patience. What we have to do now is we're going to cover this. I'm going to leave it right here in the bowl. We're going to cover it. We're going to let it rest or rise. Ferment is actually what this step is called. We're going to let that yeast do its work. We're going to let it ferment for about an hour and a half. So what I'm going to do is in that time, I'm going to clean up some of my mess. If you're watching this recorded, I encourage you to, during this hour and a half, go do some homework, read a book, play outside, watch some TV or something. Don't forget about this though. Set you a timer. I'm going to set a timer for about an hour and a half here. We'll come back and we'll move on to the next steps. All right, so it's covered up there. Now, a lot of times you will see in recipes, it'll say to place, put this in a warm place. Unless your house is extremely cold or extremely hot, room temperature should be fine for this. In professional kitchens or professional bake shops, they will use what's called a proofer that has the humidity and temperature controlled. Most houses don't have proofers. A lot of times people want to put their oven on low and set this next to the oven. I find that even an oven on low, because most ovens will not go below around 170, 180 degrees, that even that's too much heat. It'll get the side of your bowl, especially a metal or glass bowl, it'll get it too hot. And at 140 is where yeast is killed. We don't want to kill the yeast, we want it to do its work. So just set it in the warmest place you can find, preferably not under an air conditioner vent or a heater vent, but just in a corner somewhere with this towel over it, and just let it do its work. So again, we'll come back in about an hour and a half and then move on to the next step. All right, through the magic of video editing, and it's been about an hour and a half now, so we're going to check on our dough. And as you can see, that volume has increased considerably. The yeast has been in there doing its work. The dough has risen. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do the next step that is called folding. And before we start with that, we're going to take a little bit of the bread flour. We're going to lightly dust our board here. This is a cutting board, but I'm going to use it as a work surface. You can leave a little of the flour on your hands if you want to. And we're just going to take this dough, kind of pull it away from the sides of the bowl there. You'll notice the volume went down considerably. We've pushed some of the gas bubbles out of there. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this and turn this out onto our cutting board, top side down as best we can. Now, what we're going to do, this is called folding. We're going to take one side, doesn't matter which side you start with, we're going to take the right side, we're going to kind of stretch it and pull it over to the middle, like that. Kind of press it down a little. Then we're going to come and do the other side. Fold it over. Then we're going to take the top side, stretch it out a little, fold it over. And then the bottom, stretch it out, fold it over. Basically what this step does is we are getting some of the air bubbles out of there. We are incorporating this dough a little bit more. And when you flour your board, you want to make sure you don't use a whole lot of flour. You don't want to work too much extra flour into your dough because it will make your final product a little dry, maybe even a little more dense than what you want. So now, all right, so what we're going to do at this point now is we're going to take this lump of dough, this big roll of dough that we've got right here, and we're going to use this tool that's called a bench knife. Mine's actually just a scraper, but it will function as a bench knife. And this is just a tool that bakers use to, again, cut pieces of dough to portion it out, or scaling as it's known. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to cut some pieces, and I'm using my scale again. If you don't have a scale, that's fine, but we want to get pieces that are about 1.5 ounces each. And if you don't have a scale, the way you can tell is when you roll it together, it's going to be about the size of a golf ball. So that's the size that you're looking for there. Again, if you're using a scale, you can just measure it out. So I'm going to cut several pieces here that are going to be 1.5 ounces. And we do want them to be as close to the same to each other as possible for a couple of reasons. Number one, when we are serving these, especially if you're serving like in a restaurant setting or something, you want the portions to be the same from person to person. But the main reason is we want these to cook at the same rate. We don't want a really large one because it will take longer to cook than one that is much smaller. So we want to try to get these as close to 1.5 ounces as we can. And if you have to trim off a little bit, that's fine. Or if you get a piece that's too small and you need to add a little bit more to it, then you can just do that. So I'm going to keep portioning these out, and I'm going to pause the video, and again, through the magic of editing, we'll have these all ready to go in just a second. Okay, so we've got all these portioned out here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to shape them. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to take one of these little dough balls, and we're going to, and I'll try to do it close to the camera here so you can see. Excuse me. We're going to take this and we're going to pull the top down with our thumbs, and then with our fingers we're going to kind of tuck it under. Then we're going to turn it a little bit and do the same thing. This is called, again, part of the scaling, portioning out, and we're rounding these, getting them ready to kind of go into that roll shape that we're looking for. So once you've done this several times around the whole thing, and again, one of the things we're doing is we're working out any air bubbles that might be trapped. You may not can see here, but there are several that have risen to the surface here as we've been working with this piece of dough. So once we get it rounded like that, we're going to set it back on our work surface. I'll move some of these out of the way. And again, we're going to continue to do that with each of these. Pulling down from the tops with our thumbs, tucking it under, turning it, doing the same thing several times. You'll start to feel, especially when you get to some of these later pieces here, as you work this dough, the top will start to get tacky again. where it has not had time to dry out in the air. That's good, that's what you're looking for. And again, small golf ball size pieces like that. I'm going to continue to work these, and once I get all these done, we'll come back and show you how to pan them up. All right, so we finished portioning these rolls out, and the baking term that's used for this is called make-up. So we've made them up into roll shapes. Now what we're going to do is transfer them from our cutting board over to our baking pan. I'm going to use some parchment paper. This is just to put a liner down to help keep the rolls from sticking to the pan. I've got a half-size sheet pan here. As you can see, we've got these nice and rounded right there. This batch made about 27 rolls. I think I'm just only going to be able to get about 24 on the pan here, maybe. We'll see. My cutting board is a little bit bigger than my sheet pan here. This is a half-size sheet pan. And again, you can see that these rolls are not exactly the same size. That's okay. Tried to get them as close as I could, still utilizing my time wisely. We want to have a little bit of space in between these because we're going to let these rest on this pan. They are going to continue to proof or ferment. They are going to get larger. So we want to give them room to expand. Then of course when we bake them, they will get even larger. So yes, I've only got room for 24 on my pan here. So what we're going to do is for about another 30 minutes, we're going to let these rise right there on the pan, and then about 10 minutes before they're done rising, I'm going to put my oven on 400 degrees, 375 if you're using a convection oven. I don't have a convection oven, so I'll put that at 400. Show you how we'll prep them and then get them into the oven. All right, so it's been about 30 minutes. Our rolls have started to rise some more, which is a good thing. The last step before we put them in the oven is we're going to make an egg wash to brush on the top. This will give them a nice glossy appearance, help them to brown a little bit better. So all we're going to do is take 1/4 cup of water and we're going to crack 1 large egg right into the water. And I'm just going to take a fork and we're going to just mix this raw egg in with that water. This is what's called an egg wash. Again, it'll give the top of the rolls a nice glossy look when they come out of the oven. So I'm going to take my pastry brush. I've got a pastry brush right here. And I'm just going to dip this pastry brush into this egg wash. And I'm just going to lightly brush it on top of each roll. I don't want to push down too hard. Just kind of. All right. Don't you love the magic of video editing? All right, so we've got all these with our egg wash on there. Our oven is at 400 degrees, so I'm going to just take this over there. Pop it right in there, and those are going to cook for about 12 to 14 minutes. And we'll check them at about 10, make sure they're not overcooking. We might rotate them towards the end there. And then in a few minutes, we'll pull them out and see how they look. All right, it's been about 13 minutes. I think the rolls are ready, so we're going to get them out of the oven and take a look at them. Look at that right there. Nice and golden brown on the top. That egg wash did its job just like we knew that it would. These smell absolutely delicious. These would be great served with whatever you're serving for dinner. These would be great, or like I said, you can let them cool and use them as slider buns, whatever you like. So this is how you do soft rolls. So I hope you enjoyed that, and bon appetit.